Welcome to Genki Zone. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please subscribe it. I'm Alex. And I'm Ben. Today, we have a truly fascinating explainer lined up for you. We are looking at Japan's massive 10,000-year timeline. And when you really look at the historical data, you start to see that Japan's history acts almost like a giant pendulum. It violently swings back and forth between fierce national isolation and then periods of intense global integration. It's an incredible story. So let's jump right into this timeline. But before we get into the heavy history, I want to ask you a quick question just to set the stage. Imagine living in prehistoric Japan. Would you prefer the hunter-gatherer life of the indigenous Jomon people or the agricultural farming life of the incoming Yayoi? Drop your answer in the comments as we explore what both of those lives actually look like. We really have a lot of ground to cover today. We'll be looking at ancient roots, classical splendor, the rise of the samurai, Tokugawa rule, the Meiji Revolution, and finally, post-war culture. Let's get started. Section 1. Ancient Roots, Jomon and Yaois. Okay, so the Jomon period spans an absolute mind-boggling amount of time, starting way back around 16,500 years ago. They were essentially the first masters of pottery, famous for these totally unique cord-marked designs. But honestly, it's the sheer scale of their settlements that is just mind-blowing. Take the Sendai Maruyama site in northern Japan, for example. I had no idea these weren't just small, temporary camps. Some of these settlements were literally the size of modern baseball stadiums. They were incredibly complex, settled communities that were actively trading over massive distances for materials like jade and obsidian. Right, but that isolated development was completely disrupted. Between 1000 and 800 BC, the Yayoi people immigrated from the Asian mainland. And they brought the Neolithic Revolution with them. Stuff like rice cultivation, weaving, and advanced iron and bronze tools. Because of this totally new agricultural base, the population experienced a massive tenfold boom, growing to somewhere between 1 and 4 million people. But, this shift wasn't entirely peaceful. It also brought increased social stratification, segregated grave sites in fierce tribal warfare. Fast forward a bit to the 8th century, and Japan undergoes a massive shift into centralized power. By 710 AD, the capital was established at Nara, marking a period where the state rapidly centralized, modeled itself after Tang China, and heavily integrated the Buddhist religion. Then, in 794, the capital moved over to modern-day Kyoto, which kicked off the famous Heian period. Section 2. Classical Splendor, Nara and Heian. So the Nara period was pretty much defined by massive temple-building projects driven by Emperor Shomu. But it wasn't all glorious. Devastating smallpox epidemics had just wiped out up to a third of Japan's entire population. Emperor Shomu actually believed his own lack of piety caused these disasters, so he heavily taxed the surviving peasantry to fund the absolute crown jewel of his redemption, Todaiji. Its Great Buddha Hall was the largest wooden building in the world at the time, and it housed a 15-meter, 500-ton bronze statue of the seated Buddha, the largest ever made. It's just a staggering architectural achievement. Moving into the Heian period, political power shifted over to the Fujiwara clan, who essentially ruled from behind the scenes in Kyoto. The imperial court became completely isolated from actual political administration. Instead, their lives were governed entirely by miyabi, which translates to this intense aesthetic refinement. It was all about good taste, poetry, and taking sedate pleasure in very small things, like falling leaves. It was a society where elegant presentation and strict rank meant absolutely everything. And the lives of aristocratic women in the Heian court were especially rigid. They were constantly hidden behind silk screens, layered in incredibly heavy silk clothing. And yes, artificial eyebrows and blackened teeth were the absolute peak of fashion. But despite this intense physical confinement, these women really dominated the culture. They pioneered a Japanese phonetic alphabet and wrote true literary masterpieces like Murasaki Shikabu's The Tale of Genji, which is widely considered the world's very first psychological novel. Which brings us to another question for you all. What do you actually think of the Heian trend of blackening teeth? It was a highly specific standard of classical beauty that lasted for centuries among the elite. Let us know your thoughts below. Now, while the Heian aristocrats were busy with poetry and aesthetics, they completely neglected the provinces. Private landowners built up their own private armies, and that pendulum swung violently from civilian aristocrats to military might. This era culminated in the year 1600 at the legendary Battle of Sekigahara. Tokugawa Ieyasu secured absolute victory, but only because a rival general, Kobayakawa Hideaki, famously defected right in the middle of the battle. Which brings up a great question for the comments. Is betrayal ever justified in war? Section 3.
Rise of the samurai.
Now, this military rule actually started centuries earlier, back in 1192 when Minamoto no Yoritomo established the first shogunate in Kamakura. And this newly formed warrior class faced their ultimate test in the late 13th century when Kublai Khan launched massive Mongol invasions in 1274 and 1281. The samurai fought incredibly fiercely from defensive walls, but what truly saved Japan were devastating typhoons that struck the Mongol fleets on both occasions. The Japanese called this the kamikaze, or the divine wind, believing the gods had literally protected their island. Just think about the strategic nightmare of that scenario for a second. If you were a Mongol commander, having lost massive chunks of your army to fierce samurai defenses, and then two separate, perfectly timed typhoons, would you have tried a third invasion? History tells us the Mongols finally gave up on conquering Japan after that. Section 4. Tokugawa Rule and Sakoku. Following that pivotal victory at Sekigahara we mentioned earlier, the Tokugawa Shogunate brought 265 years of continuous domestic peace to Japan. But that peace came at a very strict price. To maintain absolute control and eliminate the perceived threats of European colonialism and Christianity, the shogunate implemented Sakoku, or the locked country policy. They passed edicts completely banning citizens from leaving and restricted all European influence to a tiny Dutch trading factory confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. It's pretty wild to think about the unexpected results of that total isolation, because without constant warfare draining all their resources, Japan saw an incredible cultural blooming. Late in the Edo period, literacy rates hit 40% for adult men and 30% for women. This was achieved through small private elementary schools called terakoya, set up all across the country. It became this incredibly stable, highly literate society. However, while society stabilized and education flourished, military and navigational technology completely stagnated for 2.5 centuries. So here's a real trade-off for you. Would you have preferred Japan to stay isolated and peaceful, or open up and keep pace with global technological advancements? Well, that choice was ultimately made for them in 1853 when American Commodore Perry's advanced warships forced Japan to open up. The pendulum swung aggressively back toward global integration, sparking the Meiji Revolution in 1868. Japan modernized at lightning speed, heavily aided by efforts like the Iwakura mission, where Japanese scholars and leaders traveled the world to study Western systems. So, what do you think was the most impressive thing about the Meiji modernization? Unfortunately, this rapid industrial and military growth eventually fueled overextension, leading to Pearl Harbor and Japan's devastating surrender in 1945. Section 5. The Meiji Revolution. Section 6. Post-war cultural transformation. Stripped of its military power, Japan was fundamentally reorganized during the U.S. occupation from 1945 to 1952. Under General MacArthur, sweeping changes were made. The emperor issued the Human Declaration, formally renouncing his divine status, and figures like Maeda Tamon completely reformed the education system. With government censorship officially abolished, Japan totally pivoted. They birthed a golden age of cinema, created iconic kaiju monster movies, and we saw an absolute explosion of anime and manga. Young people all across the world began consuming Japanese pop culture. They conquered the global imagination not through force, but through unmatched creative exports. And that brings our massive timeline to a close. We've watched the pendulum swing from the isolated cord-marked pottery makers of the Jomon to the unified power of the shoguns, and finally to the globally integrated pop culture powerhouse of today.
So we leave you with one final question for this explainer. From